Hi, this is Daniel Alpine, animation historian, and welcome to the first episode of the newly rebranded Animation Look Back. This month marks the 85th anniversary of the iconic cat and mouse duo Tom and Jerry. This lecture will be a little different. Since my thesis short cartoon, Joe's Story, covered the creation of the characters, I thought I could talk this time about the history of the characters after the 1940s. But long story short, after MGM, the richest and most prestigious film studio of the 1930s, struggled to start a successful cartoon series, two animators, Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera, in their spare time directed a simple cat and mouse cartoon called Puss Gets the Boot, and it wasn't until 1 year later that this would become an official series. Throughout the 40s, the cartoon series Tom and Jerry proved to be a success and would win multiple awards. But when the 1950s arrived, things went downhill. In the 50s, the medium of television was officially widespread and it caused serious concerns because it was thought to be the death of cinema. And unfortunately, this had a significant effect on theatrical cartoons. But it was around this time that movie studios started to look for certain gimmicks to draw the audience back to the theaters. These included early 3D films and cinerama screens, which wrapped around the audience, and Technorama, which was a very widescreen format. What MGM did was decide to produce our cartoons in CinemaScope, which was an earlier version of widescreen films. The first CinemaScope Tom and Jerry cartoon was 1954's Pet Peeve. The switch from a full screen format to the widescreen proved to be a challenge because it was difficult to time the action of the films in sort of a letterbox, if you will. But still, the popularity of television caused the revenue for theatrical cartoons to dip. Because of this, MGM started to cut the budgets on their cartoons, and in that, the animation started to become more simpler. This was also because the 1950s was the rise of United Productions of America, which pioneered the art of limited animation. MGM's cost cutting also resulted in the recycling of stories and pieces of animation. Two cartoons from the 1950s were shot for shot remakes of two earlier Tom and Jerry cartoons. Around this time is when MGM started to reissue their older cartoons and saw that the theatrical reissues earned as much as newer cartoons. Joe Barbera remembered that soon he received a phone call from the executives, which was in order to close down the studio. At first, this was a real body blow for Bill and Joe, but soon the two would team up once again to start up a new studio that would produce cartoons for television. And thus, Hanna-Barbera Studios was founded. The last Tom and Jerry cartoon Bill and Joe directed was Tot Watchers in 1958, which was released 1 year after MGM closed down the cartoon studio. But soon in 1961, MGM decided to resurrect the Tom and Jerry cartoon series. For this revival, former UPA animator Gene Deitch was contacted to start up production. In 1959, Gene Deitch moved from New York City to what is now called the Czech Republic. What's funny is that before, Gene Deitch was never really a fan of the old Tom and Jerry cartoons because he viewed those as needlessly violent. But after Gene signed on to direct new cartoons for the series, he actually did adopt a new view and respect of the cartoons. What he saw was that the series was popular because it actually took violence seriously, and it was a classic scenario of a little character fighting a larger character. While Gene Deitch was an excellent cartoonist, his Tom and Jerry cartoons are considered not his best work because these were very, well, surreal. But it really wasn't his fault. This was because, in contrast to the older Hanna-Barbera cartoons, Gene was given a very tight budget of $100,000. Because of this, the cartoons utilized limited animation and the character designs were simplified, and the music and sound effects was virtually absent. I never actually saw the Gene Deitch Tom and Jerry cartoons until I was an early adolescent, and even I thought that these were very bizarre. But to be fair, a neat aspect that Gene Deitch did in his cartoons was bring the characters into more exotic locales that includes the Wild West and a jungle, in contrast to the typical house in earlier Tom and Jerry cartoons. Even though the series was successful, the reviews for these were bad. Gene Deitch actually understood the criticism toward his Tom and Jerry cartoons and thought that if he was given a larger budget, these would have resembled the older Hanna-Barbera cartoons. But the Gene Deitch series does have its fans and is often considered good on its own merits. In 1962, MGM decided to ditch the Deitch unit after 13 cartoons. The year after, veteran Warner Brothers cartoons director Chuck Jones was hired to direct new Tom and Jerry cartoons at his new studio, Sib Towers 12 Productions. While Chuck Jones was an excellent cartoon director and he actually did receive a higher budget at his request, his Tom and Jerry's were, well, absurd. The issue was that Chuck's style of comedy was different than Bill and Joe's. Chuck Jones' style of comedy was more verbal, and if he was allowed to let Tom and Jerry talk in his cartoons, this would have been easier, but since it was a strict tradition that the characters be all pantomime, this wasn't very successful. The Cat and Mouse also received a distinct redesign that was more in line of Chuck's drawing style. In 1967, MGM pulled the plug on the theatrical Tom and Jerry cartoons. But 2 years prior, the Tom and Jerry cartoons would debut on television, and similar to the Looney Tunes and Popeye, the television airings would keep the characters in the public conscience. But it was also during the television airings that the cartoons were re edited for offensive content. But before we continue, I should warn you that the images you're about to see in this part feature very unfortunate racial and ethnic stereotypes that were a commonplace in the 1940s and 50s. But understand that this is purely for educational reasons. So let's proceed. A lot of the changes were a simple editing out of scenes where the characters were in blackface. A sort of problem that happened during the re edits was that a few cartoons had noticeable jump cuts after the offensive scenes were cut out. But the real problem was the earlier Tom and Jerry cartoons was Tom's first owner, which was an African American woman that was very unfortunately named Mammy Two Shoes. The first voice of the character was a radio and film actress, Lillian Randolph, which audiences could still see in the classic film It's a Wonderful Life. The voice Lillian Randolph used as Mammy Two Shoes is still considered very stereotypical. The controversy over the character was the reason that she was retired after the cartoon Push Button Kitty. The first re edit of cartoons featuring this character was Chuck Jones actually reanimated her scenes, replacing her with a white woman instead. Later, it was a simple matter of redubbing her voice. As a kid, I remember that in the Cartoon Network airings of the Tom and Jerry cartoons, her voice was redubbed from a different actress, and what she did was make the character sound more sophisticated. Animation historian Mark Hausler said that he doesn't know if that was any better or any worse. In the mid 2010s, I noticed that on Cartoon Network's spin off channel, Boomerang, the old Tom and Jerry cartoons that featured Mammy Two Shoes no longer aired, and don't expect to see those cartoons on the streaming platform Max. One less controversial cartoon that I remember seeing on Cartoon Network once was Blues Cat Blues, because that was very sad and the ending was dark. One Tom and Jerry cartoon I remember never seeing on TV before was His Mouse Friday, because it's very, very offensive to African Americans. And much to the criticism of old school cartoon fans, two Tom and Jerry cartoons, as of now, are still unavailable on DVD. But now let's backtrack. In 1975, Tom and Jerry were reunited with their creators, Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera, this time for a television Saturday morning cartoon series. I actually did see one episode of this incarnation on Cartoon Network as a kid, and looking back, it was bad. This was because, in contrast to the theatrical cartoons, this series was made for kids, and at the time, television networks would not allow any sort of violence in kids' cartoons. In this, Tom and Jerry were now friends that went on different adventures together. In 1980, Filmation, the studio responsible for a lot of now classic television cartoons, such as Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, started production on a new TV series starring Tom and Jerry. I actually saw 3 episodes of this version, and I can tell you this was much worse than the previous television series of Tom and Jerry. Trust me, even though Tom and Jerry were rivals in this as before, every aspect of this TV series was awful. The animation was very limited, the music was very bizarre, the voice acting was very wooden, and the stories were boring. But 4 years after the Filmation series ended, Ted Turner soon bought MGM, but due to a few issues, had to sell it back. But he actually still had the rights to a lot of the MGM properties, including their cartoon series, which in that he's owned Tom and Jerry. In 1990, Turner and Hanna-Barbera would start production on a new TV series starring Tom and Jerry that was called Tom and Jerry Kids. What was important about this reiteration was that this was the first show to air on the Fox Kids block on the channel Fox. While this series did use full animation, and it did try to be a better tribute to the older cartoons, still, this was part of a very, well, unusual trend of taking classic cartoon characters and, well, turning them into little children. To be honest, it was really the same song that was more memorable than the series itself. But in 1992, the iconic Cat and Mouse would return to cinemas, but this time in an animated feature film, Tom and Jerry the Movie. Joe Barbera in this acted as a creative consultant. The film reached American cinemas in 1993 through a distribution from Miramax Films, and it was critically panned. I've never seen it, but from what I've seen, the story was bad. One person even called it a ripoff of Disney's The Rescuers and Don Bluth's All Dogs Go to Heaven. And as could be expected from an animated children's film of the 1990s, this was a musical, and all the songs were complete trash. But perhaps the number one reason for the film's awfulness was because Tom and Jerry actually talked throughout the entire film. While I know that Tom and Jerry did talk in a few cartoons, but it was a real rarity. But in this was a real slap in the face to the entire franchise. Fun fact, the voice of Tom in the movie was veteran Pixar voice actor Richard Kind. And it shouldn't be a surprise that the film was a box office dud. But 3 years after the film's American release, Warner Brothers would merge with Turner Entertainment, and now Warner Brothers is the owners of Tom and Jerry. The first Warner Brothers produced Tom and Jerry content was a series of direct-to-video movies. I actually did own the first direct-to-video Tom and Jerry movie, Tom and Jerry and the Magic Ring. However, the direct-to-video Tom and Jerry movies are considered more miss than hit. 2017's Tom and Jerry, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory also received terrible reviews. But one notable Tom and Jerry production at this time was a new animated series called Tom and Jerry Tales, which aired on Kids WB. In my opinion, this was the best Tom and Jerry TV series because even though the violence was toned down a little because this was still produced for kids, still, it was actually respectful to the old cartoons. In 2014, Cartoon Network would air a reboot called The Tom and Jerry Show. I did try to give this a fair chance, but soon I stopped watching because it was really the Flash animation was off-putting to me. Around this time, Warner Brothers had been trying to get a new Tom and Jerry feature film off the ground. The project wouldn't officially start production until director Tim Story, the director of the two Fantastic Four films of the 2000s, was hired, though COVID-19 happened during this time. Tom and Jerry would return to the silver screen in a new movie that this time was a mixture of live action and animated characters. The reviews were bad. Honestly, the one positive aspect of this was the animation of the different characters, even though it was done using the computer instead of pencil and paper. Still, the animators tried very hard to mimic the classic cartoons, and the scenes that featured Tom and Jerry's traditional antics were a highlight. But still, the overall criticism toward this film was that it barely focused on Tom and Jerry. And that was because the writer of the film was told from the Warner Brothers executives that Tom and Jerry shouldn't be the center of this, which was a very poor and rather, well, strange decision. A part of the marketing for this film were two special shorts that were produced from the team that did the Looney Tune cartoons series on Max. And in contrast to the movie itself, these were actually good. And soon after, the studio responsible for the 2014 Cartoon Network Tom and Jerry show were brought back to produce a new series called Tom and Jerry in New York. And actually, this was a lot better because the animation was more refined. But 2 months ago, Warner Brothers announced that a third Tom and Jerry feature film would be released, and I think all of you out there is thinking, oh no, not again. But what does sound interesting is that multi-talented celebrities, Rashida Jones and Will McCormick, were actually hired to write the script for this. Well, that does sound promising, and, well, third time's the charm. With any amount of luck, perhaps this will fix the sins of the last two Tom and Jerry feature films. But for now, happy 85th birthday, Tom and Jerry. Well, that's all for now, and I'll be seeing you.